Welcome to the latest Curator Talk as part of GOMA's Online at Home series. My name is Katie Bruce and I'm one of the curators here at GOMA, and I'm talking to you from the exhibition Domestic Bliss, which I curated and opened up in the gallery last March. Today I wanted to talk to you about the Corner Cabinet, which has works from the collection but our social history collection, which is, I guess, more unusual for a modern and contemporary art building to have social history objects in it. But these are an important part of this exhibition because they open up conversations about trade, economy, empire, and the transatlantic slave trade in the city. They also are really important because they influence the two artist commissions that I'll go on to talk about later that we commissioned for Domestic Bliss from Kamara Taylor and Mandy McIntosh. The idea behind this exhibition, Domestic Bliss, was to look at some of the incredible, beautiful objects in our collections that are really objects of desire and that we wanted to show off in some ways, but actually when you look more closely at them or you start to interrogate them or look at them with a kind of 21st century lens or a queer or a feminist lens, that they start to tell a more complex story. The first object that I would like to talk about is this Wedgwood teapot. It's earthenware and it has a print transfer technique, which means that it is dated post the 1750s when print transfers were used and developed in order to make more easily mass-produced objects more economically, which then opened up the market for more accurate prints of designs for a wider audience. This particular design on the front is called The Tea Party by Robert Hancock and was developed in a pattern book or design book in the late 1750s. And so we know it can be dated from after that. It was a really popular design, and as you can see, it features a well-dressed couple in the open air and they are drinking tea. There's various tea paraphernalia on the table, including a sugar bowl, and the lady delicately stirs a cup of tea. Notably as well, there is a young black, presumed to be enslaved domestic servant pouring water into a tea kettle. The reason for including this teapot in Domestic Bliss is, on the one hand, it talks to genteel tea drinking, but it also, with a 21st lens, you can look back on it to look at ideas of trade and economy, which in the context of Glasgow and this building as a Royal Exchange, where sugar was brought, weighed and measured, and the wealth of this city was built on the back of slavery, it becomes a really important object to start to have a much broader conversation around about these issues. The abolitionist movement brought a much wider understanding to the general public about the consumables that they were using on a daily basis, say like tea or coffee or sugar, were built on the backs of slaves in plantations in inhumane conditions. But there was still a division or an invisibility of the reality of that situation in terms of the objects that were mass-produced and in everyday consumption, but even going on into things like the Empire exhibitions, where countries from across the Commonwealth were shown as part of showcases about the Empire, more as spectacle or exotic or other, and slavery was never mentioned in there. And so this cabinet that we have here has a couple of examples of souvenirs that the British people or visitors to the Empire exhibition in 1938 could buy, take home, and then still consume things like tea or coffee or rum, all made with products from countries across the Empire that were originally where most of these slaves were taken to, and the plantations. And of particular reference to the tobacco trade is the object at the bottom of the cabinet, an ashtray from the Sheesh Mahal restaurant. On the one level, it points to a time when we could sit and smoke over dinner in restaurants, and these branded ashtrays were part of everyday tableware in restaurants. But the other way, it points to a history of migration with the South Asian community coming into Scotland and working in restaurants, but it also points to the consumption of tobacco and the production of it. And then that relates neatly back into this building because it is built on the site of the tobacco lord William Cunningham of Laneshaw. And so the whole history of tobacco and slavery and transatlantic can then start to be explored through work. And leads me nicely on to talk about Kamara Taylor's commission for Domestic Bliss. He was interested in the history of the building and trade, connections to the Caribbean, but also the idea around about abolition and Scotland's role in that. But equally from the point of those that still around the time of abolition were supporting slavery. And the work that is coming into this exhibition is called Empire of Love. And it takes its name from a poem by the writer James Boswell, who is more known for his biography of Samuel Johnson, but wrote a poem called No Abolition of Slavery, Empire of Love, a poem. Taylor was really interested by this and the idea that there were influential people still arguing for slavery at the time of abolition. The work Empire of Love is a really beautiful piece in that it is engraving excerpts from this poem, including lines like no abolition of slavery, licentious joy, and let's justify the plantation's ways, onto Zippo lighters. So making a direct connection into tobacco, Zippo lighters, but also that idea of engraving and gift and value that's there with that. And I also love the fact that the artist is placing an incendiary device into a building to talk about slavery, empire, colonialism, and the legacies of that in terms of racism that we find today. So heading back into the cabinet of social history objects, the final object is a Glasgow Miles Better mug. I moved to Glasgow in the 1980s, so this emblem of Mr. Happy and Glasgow's Miles Better is really ingrained on my teenage brain. And when I started to talk to the artist Mandy McIntosh about her commission for this exhibition, this was the object that she was completely drawn to because she remembers it as well as being above Springburn Railway and really emblematic. Even at the time, Mandy thought that it was a brilliant way of branding the city, really recognisable, and in some ways a slightly flawed way of sticking a massive Mr. Happy as a sticking plaster over a lot of the troubled issues that were in the city at the time in terms of mass unemployment and violence and issues with social housing that were going on. But equally, when you're looking back at it now, that idea of a really popular image to talk about the cultural capital of a city that had the Third Eye Centre, was moving towards the city of culture. There are slight problems within that as well. And inspired by the Glasgow Miles Better mug, Mandy took this proposal to a group of women that she was working with in Ferguslie called the Figi Needlers. She already knew that a woman there was working with printed mugs and wanted to talk to them about the ideas around regeneration, what concerned them as a community. Ferguslie as a community is one of the most deprived areas in Scotland and has often had companies or people coming in telling them how that they could better the area or do other things. And so for Mandy, it felt quite similar to the Glasgow Miles Better campaign, where could she have a conversation with these women? So rather than a design or a brand that covers over everything, all the beautiful conversations, all the energy, all the dynamics of a community, what would a brand look like if it came from this community itself? And so rather than one mug, the women have worked together to propose a selection of mugs, again, which can be mass produced through this printing system. But here are in a unique collection as a sculpture with concerns like poverty or funeral poverty, how the people from Ferguslie are known as the ham and eggs. So there's a lot of humour in here, and there's a sense of the joy and fun and creativity that the community themselves have and can present and can contribute to ideas of regeneration. It shouldn't be that an architectural company comes in or a design company comes in and defines what an area is. This area, Ferguslie in particular, can define itself. As we move towards reopening later this year, which we're all really excited about, this is one of the exhibitions that you'll be able to see when we reopen. And also, as we go further forward, what I really hope is that we'll be able to add to that corner cupboard with different objects from the social history collection, including a hodgepodge glass from the 1800s, which was an elite dining club in Glasgow full of rich merchants connected to the trades that I've been speaking about. There'll also hopefully be the work by Kamara Taylor, and another donation from the Empire Cafe, which was a Commonwealth Games project with Louise Welsh and Jude Barber, which talked about the histories of the transatlantic slave trade and Glasgow in the city. So all great things for you to come and enjoy when we reopen later this year.